Coming up on Why Should I Trust You? We're back after a break, and there's a lot to catch up on. A lot happened while we were gone. Kennedy making a big move to counter the judge who ruled his handpicked ACIP committee lacked the expertise to steer America's vaccine policy. You've got the Trump administration unveiling its budget proposal for next year, a value statement. And it goes big on military defense while calling for big cuts again in medical research. And the EPA announced it would invest in efforts to reduce microplastics in America's drinking water. So we're going to get into all that, but we've got a big main course as well. The administration's targeting of what it labels DEI research has gutted funding for research into racial health disparities. Today, we ask whether the way America was researching this critical issue was actually working. The differences in life expectancy between Black and white Americans persist. Our guest today is health equity researcher Dr. Jerel Ezell. While he is critical of the current administration's approach to cutting funding for research into health disparities, what's interesting is Ezell wasn't a big fan of how this type of research was approached before either. So what needed to change? And where are we on the road to getting there? What's at stake? We truly have a lot of ground to cover today, so let's get started. Welcome back.
Good to be back.
We are really back in a big way.
We were gone, man. It felt good to take a break, but that feels like ages ago. You know, it was nice. We took some time off. We saw family, friends. But anyway, we have news to cover and then our main topic. But first, who are we? I'm Brenda Adhikari.
Yeah, I'm Tom Johnson.
I'm Maggie Bartlett.
And I'm Dr. Mark Abdumalik.
Yeah, and if you've forgotten, this is Why Should I Trust You, a podcast, a Substack, all about the breakdown in trust in public health and medicine and science. And don't forget to email us at questions@whyshoulditrustyou.net. We read and share every note.
Yeah. So, you know, I really tried to go like offline on this break, but you all know that I'm terrible at that. It was a wonderful break. My family and I went to Utah. We went to the national parks. We were like hiking and all that stuff. But, you know, I gotta just say every night I would check in with the news. It like weirdly makes me feel calm. And I saw news that Kennedy's, like his strategy for dealing with that whole ACIP, the judge's ruling that froze not only his ACIP, but all the changes that it had recommended over the past year to our vaccine policy. So, Mark, first question to you. What is going on here?
Right. So go back in time a little bit, and you'll recall that last month, the judge stepped in and essentially hit pause on major parts of Kennedy's vaccine policy overhaul. So he even blocked the committee from even meeting. So right away, we heard there was immediate talk of appealing the decision, and we haven't seen that yet, at least not yet anyway. But instead, the administration made what looks kind of like a chess move, and that move was to rewrite the ACIP charter in ways that are meant to make that judge's objections harder to stick. So that's a little confusing, isn't it? It's just like he sort of changed the rules. So what did they do? First, they broadened who qualifies as an expert. Because remember, the judge had said the committee as a whole lacked that expertise needed. So the new charter adds layers of experts like toxicology, pediatric neurodevelopment, and even with people with knowledge of recovery from serious vaccine injury. Second, they said, let's put a much greater emphasis on the potential harms and understudied safety questions. And then third, they added new outside groups as advisors, and some of those have historically been skeptical of vaccines. So the move here seems to be more than like legal damage control. It's an attempt to reshape who gets a seat at the ACIP table, what kinds of expertise counts, and then what questions ACIP is even expected to focus on. So this is a watch this space kind of thing and see. We'll see what happens with that new committee.
Yeah, I would just add, and we're not experts on this, but, experts are beginning to weigh in on this and really raising a question here as to whether HHS can rewrite the charter for this committee in a way that allows Kennedy to put these different, as you said, Mark, these different experts on it, sort of redefining the mission of the committee, when this has been the mission of the committee for decades, has been vaccine policy. And again, all of this comes out of Congress. Congress made the law that said agencies can make expert committees, but they've got to define what the mission of the committee is, and it has to be balanced. It has to have, some different balance of expertise in it. And does HHS have that authority to change that charter in a way that kind of breaks from the traditions of the past several decades.
Right. It feels like it's ripe for another countersuit. I mean, I don't see how this doesn't just continue being a legal ping pong, but I guess we will see
We shall
as the
see.
world turns. So the other big thing we saw was the Trump administration unveiled its budget proposal for next year. And, and I want to make clear, it's a proposal. He unveiled a proposal last year too. And Tom, science research, once again, doesn't look like it's going to be a big winner here.
Yeah, this is, again, as you said, like, this is a value statement. This is, an indication of what the administration wants. Congress kind of blew off the last year's proposal from the administration and funded science. But it is kind of stark. I mean, it basically says the administration wants to go big with military, wants to eliminate what it sees as wasteful programs, wants to eliminate anything that's woke, whatever that means. And for the NIH, it's calling for a $5 billion cut. It wants to downsize and consolidate institutions within the NIH. Lawmakers aren't going to like this. They tend to be supportive of NIH research. It brings projects to their home states. And really what this kind of seems to be doing is it's sort of pitting Russ Vought of OMB, who's really the mind behind this budget proposal. And frankly, it sort of raises on the other side, Director Jay Bhattacharya, who told us when we spoke with him, he is a proponent and a defender of good research. He doesn't want to see across the board cuts. He would be aligned on cutting kind of quote unquote woke or DEI projects. But, this will be sort of an interesting balancing game for the NIH to defend science, but also be on the team of the administration that wants to reduce this and find savings in this while investing in things like the military.
Right. I mean, yet again, this also feels like a deja vu all over again from the conversation on the budget last year. And then finally, the administration announced that the EPA will research how much microplastics and pharmaceuticals are in our drinking water and how to get them out. And that seems like a win for MAHA.
Yeah, that definitely it is. I mean, basically what the EPA is saying, it's going to add microplastics, pharmaceuticals to sort of a priority pollutants list, which means it's going to trigger research dollars to see how prevalent microplastics are in our water, how harmful they are, and how would we get them out of the drinking water. This is, obviously a huge issue for MAHA, and it speaks to the tension that this administration, this EPA has been, experiencing with the MAHA base, because they have not been aligned. I mean, this EPA has been about deregulating. It rolled back PFAS regulations that the Biden administration put in place. So, there's critics who say this is a lot of smoke and mirrors. This is about election year politics. But this is a very important issue to MAHA, and the EPA is signaling that it hears MAHA on this specific issue. We'll see, if this does lead to new regulations. Right now, it's kind of a research endeavor.
Yeah. And to that point, Tom, it's clear that there's some efforts being made to mend fences here. There's reporting out there that there was that meeting between top level Trump cabinet officials, Kennedy, Stephen Miller was there, Susan Wiles, chief of staff. And then you had prominent MAHA names like Kelly Ryerson, who's been on the show, Alex Clark, all trying to talk about, whether or not this administration is pro MAHA. And, I think we want to get a better read on kind of what came out of that. But needless to say, this kind of MAHA MAGA rift, if you will, is not going away. It's still very much out there. But anyway, with that, we're going to shift gears to our main event. And in a moment, we're going to be talking with Dr. Jerel Ezell, a visiting professor at the University of Chicago Department of Medicine, where he studies environmental health disparities. He wrote an essay last summer titled, quote, "The One Area Where Trump's NIH Cuts Might Actually Make Sense." And that really caught our attention. And we're going to meet him in a moment. But Tom, Jerel really looks at health equity research. So help us get up to speed on what we need to know before chatting with him.
Yeah, it's sort of, maybe a way to start this is with a Rorschach test that we can lay out for everybody. I came across a study from last year that found that Black infants die at roughly twice the rate of white infants. And this study was the first to examine that trend all the way back to post, just after World War II. So long-standing, multi-decade trend. And the study's author said, quote, "The goal of this particular study was not to study the reasons, but to point out the important differences. The hope is that it can inform other studies to get to the reasons and inform policymakers about what they should do. So the question is, like, how do you hear that? And perhaps one way is, these disparities between the races when it comes to health are so deep and so entrenched that even just documenting them properly is going to take decades. And that's what has to happen. That's like the necessary groundwork before we can fully understand them and start addressing them. Another way you can hear this could be, we're facing an urgent, long-standing problem, and yet much of the research is still focused on just documenting this. Like, we know this problem. Why aren't we moving towards solving it, finding the causes and addressing the causes? And then there's probably a third way you can look at this, which is this whole enterprise, this kind of research, which, some are calling like woke DEI research, is just being overemphasized. It's wasteful, and it's just not translating to better health outcomes. So we need to sort of move away from all of this. So taking a step back, for the past several decades, we have been researching this. And it's interesting, in 2010, with the passage of the Affordable Care Act, it elevated the National Center on Minority Health and Health Disparities into a full NIH institute and charged it with improving minority health and eliminating health disparities. And this was a big change and a big job. And its budget was $210 million. At the same time, almost all parts of the NIH started to move into this health disparities issue and started researching it. More money was put towards it. So following 2020 and the racial justice protests, the Biden administration really turbocharged this investment in health equity. And by 2023, that same new department, who had the budget of $210 million, now had a budget of $525 million. Wow. It was the fastest growing institute by percentage inside the entire NIH that year. Enter the Trump administration. And by the end of last year, one tally found that that department had awarded 61% fewer grants and 38% less money towards health equity research than it had averaged over the past decade each year.
Whoa.
Yeah. So a huge turning of this focus. The Trump administration's proposed budget, which we just talked about, it actually calls for this institute to be eliminated entirely.
And that's a big step. But let's step back from politics just for a second to see what the numbers actually show. Like, how are we doing on health disparities between Black and white Americans? So go back almost 25 years ago, back in 1999, white Americans lived about 6 years longer than Black Americans. So life expectancy for whites was 77 years. For Blacks, it was just 71. Then we go through the 2000s and into the mid 2010s. And during that decade of all that investment that Tom just talked about, we actually made some real progress, and the gap narrowed to around 3.5 years at its lowest point. Again, that was in the mid 2010s. Then we all suffered and went through the pandemic, and that was a big hit, and it blew the gap wide open again. So at points during the pandemic, and it was different depending on when you looked at it, Black and Latino Americans were facing nearly double the risk of death compared to white adults. The pandemic, of course, exposed deep gaps in access to care, socioeconomic inequality, and underlying health issues. So we've come out of the pandemic, and the good news is the gap has tightened again. It's narrowed. But we're still looking at a roughly 4 to 5 year difference with whites living longer. So yes, there has been some progress, but the underlying drivers haven't gone away. And you can see that most starkly in maternal health and infant health. Black women are about 2.5 to 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes. And like Tom pointed out, Black infants are more than twice as likely to die in their first year of life. So the gaps start very early, and unfortunately, it persists through many disease states through life. We know that the NIH halted grants tied to diversity, equity, and inclusion last year. So we're back to politics here now, and that has triggered legal fights. And some of it was restored, but going forward, the NIH director, Jay Bhattacharya, he told us on this show, there's no good argument I've ever seen that suggests that the DEI funding has led to any improvement, even in minority health. So that's a jarring statement if you're talking about so many health inequalities. Well, he hasn't seen any funding that has actually made a difference. He talks about life expectancy not really moving. He's also said that we are not interested in funding DEI anymore. So some of the courts, made sure that these grants were renewed, But the administration has made a point to say that when they come up for renewal over the course of the next year, they're not going to renew them.
Yeah, so that's why we're asking, what is the best way to spend our resources to take on this issue? And when we come back, we're going to welcome Dr. Jerel Ezell. We'll be right back. Okay, we are thrilled to welcome Dr. Jerel Ezell to Why Should I Trust You? Jerel is a sociologist and public health researcher from Flint, Michigan, who studies racial health disparities. After earning degrees from the University of Michigan and Columbia's Mailman School of Public Health, he worked as an epidemiologist in Detroit and Chicago before completing his PhD at the University of Chicago. He's now an assistant professor in infectious diseases and global health at the University of Chicago and has taught at Cornell and UC Berkeley. Welcome, Jerel.
Thank you for having me.
So you wrote this piece for the New York Times last summer, and right in the middle of all these cuts that were coming down on health equity research, the administration trying to cut off what it called DEI funding. And I just want to read for the audience what you opened with. You said, quote, "I study racial disparities in health, so much of my work is, or rather was, supported by federal grants that have now been unceremoniously suspended or eliminated thanks to the Trump administration's ever-expanding war on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it might seem surprising for me to say that while I believe these funding freezes and cuts at the NIH are on the whole detrimental for the country, they also present a long overdue chance for us to rethink how we approach health disparities research." Cuts as an opportunity, Jerel?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, as you see, there's a lot of hedging and there's a good number of caveats in that statement there. And in part because, just as a little bit of backdrop here, the idea for that piece is around the health disparities research industrial complex, or what I refer to as that. And it predates Trump, the second administration, by probably about a year and a half or so. So the idea behind it was very much kind of germinating and out there before all the things that we saw happen at the NIH. And the overlap, and I think the intersections are that, yes, it is an opportunity to kind of look at the NIH and how we fund our work, but more importantly, how we look at the research and say, what should we be doing here? But it was not certainly meant to be an endorsement of kind of, let's just take a chainsaw to the entirety of the NIH and, kind of really reinvent the wheel as far as how we think about the importance of research.
So that paper you were talking about, where you talked about the health disparities research industrial complex. I mean, I will say I am not one for reading academic papers at length or in total. I don't understand them very well, but yours was, it was like reading a novel. I mean, you started off with quoting Thoreau, It was like, this is not a normal academic paper, but tell us a little bit about this health disparities industrial complex. You liken it to the military industrial complex, the prison industrial complex. It's a really provocative kind of a thesis there.
Sure. Yeah. And the thought here is not to draw too tight of a apples to apples comparison, but it's to say, if you think about those other complexes, you think about the military, and I'm just kind of speak broadly here. You think about prison, law enforcement, et cetera, right? They have, at the kind of baseline, there's a sense that they have a altruistic or a noble purpose, right? Now, obviously in application, usually it's anything but that, but the idea that we're going to protect ourselves from threats, right? Whether that's at the kind of geopolitical level or the international level or in our own cities and, counties, et cetera, that is a fairly noble ambition to have there. But what we observe, right, is that these things don't make us remarkably safer, right? In terms of the balance between how much energy, effort, and resources we put into the military, how much we put into law enforcement, the return is fairly limited. And the same argument is being made here when it comes to health disparities research, right? It is very noble. There are I won't say very few people, because we know a lot of people who don't value this research, but there is this idea that health disparities and just research, and let's say science in general, before it got super politicized, that this was considered a noble profession, that it was considered a value for society and for, humanity in general. So it operates like the prison industrial complex, the military industrial complex, with just that purely in mind, like the benevolence. But like those other two areas, the health disparities research does not really accomplish the things that it's supposed to accomplish. And also like the prison industrial complex, like the military industrial complex, there is a lot of money to be made here. So again, we're talking, it's a bit apples and oranges from the standpoint of where there's a lot more money, when it comes to those military defense contracts and prison contracts. But at the same time, the general vision of what we're doing, we're unimpeachable, right? Because we're doing this really important work. But then you look at the results and you say, who's really benefiting from this? And the subtext of the work also is saying, look at all of the health disparities research that we've done over, let's say, the last 40 or so years. So the argument is not at all that research is not valuable, that it's not fruitful in certain ways, but it's saying it's the goal, which presumably it is with health disparities research, is eliminate disparities. We haven't done that for much of anything, right? So if you think about HIV/AIDS cases, if you think about now fatal opioid overdoses, if you think about the vast majority of cancers, not to mention chronic disease, right, which is a huge part of that overall public health pie there, then you would say we're not really doing that. What we are doing, though, on some levels, we're kind of maintaining the status quo, which is good. Like you might say, well, the disparities aren't getting worse. But in terms of how much money we pour into the enterprise of health disparities research, we get very little return on what we're putting into it. So again, the argument is not that the research isn't valuable. It's just saying maybe we're not doing the right types of it. And let's look at who's ultimately benefiting the most from it, because it's not those communities who are actually experiencing those disparities.
Yeah. So just to kind of level set, I think it's just, and I think everyone's kind of understanding this from what you're saying. You are a health equity research. You think that is critical research to do. What you are saying
absolutely.
Is that over the past several decades, there has been a ballooning of money that has been sort of apportioned for this type of research, and that the universities, institutions, it's almost become sort of a gravy train of money. That if you can put together a compelling research pitch to identify more health inequity, you are likely going to receive money. Your institution is going to receive money, which is going to be used to fund that institution in all kinds of ways. And that in the end, this research, the sort of trend of this research has not been actually to solve the problem. It's been to sort of just to continually identify new faces of the problem. And that's sort of the complex that's grown up here. Is that fair? Is that what you're saying?
That is a wonderful interpretation. It's illuminating things. This is a field that's driven by novelty, not substance. So the whole thing, like when you're doing and coming up with a research project, one of the first things they're going to ask you when you're putting together a proposal is, what's the significance of it? And within that paragraph, a couple of paragraphs, when you're writing about the significance, there's going to be the question about who else has done this before. And what's going to be highly predictive of whether or not you get funded is going to be the question of, whether or not somebody has did this project before in this particular community. If the answer to that is no, you're in a fairly decent position, assuming, all other things methodologically checks out to get funded for that project. But again, that's rewarding novelty as opposed to actual substance. It's not looking at application. It's not looking at implementation, just saying, well, this is kind of novel and new. Like, we haven't studied it in this population. So we did this research project with people who are 20 to 30, who's done 31 to 40, right? And then that becomes a new project. It's like, do we need 31 to 40? Are we good with 20 to 30? And you get all these infinite permutations of research, which means you never really land at like the bigger ambition of intervening on any particular condition.
So are you saying that we're just at a point that we're just funding studies that keep telling us about a problem, but we're not really spending the money to research how to fix the problem?
I think yes, I think that's accurate. I think what is kind of nested within that, though, is this sense that the answers may be actually out there, right? So if you think about, and again, I'm kind of reflecting on some of the conversations that you've had here on the pod, there are solutions out there, but is the political will, are the resources available to actually do something about it, right? So think about bias, which was a huge part of that conversation that you had. There is a ton of research on bias. Like, there's really doesn't need to be any more research on the nature of medical bias as far as I'm concerned. You just have tons and tons of articles about it. But in terms of what are the interventions, right? Are they trainings? Is it something related to the medical curriculum or med school curriculum? Those are open conversations. But who's actually going to be the one to implement those changes? And you have this administration that comes in that says, well, that's all DEI, so we can't do that. But it's like, well, the solutions are potentially out there. We're not necessarily testing them or scaling them up, though. So at the same time, we'd be saying we do not need more research into is bias an issue. We know it is, and yet go check any given publication in any major public health journal. You will find articles this month, next month, et cetera, that are saying the same things that we've been hearing for the past 20 or 30 or so years. And that's the complex.
But we also
I'm
keep
talking
hearing
about
people say you need to replicate studies. We haven't replicated enough. Are you saying like do we know enough now to move on from establishing that there are health disparities?
Yeah, I think the whole idea of a replication crisis is maybe a little bit overstated. There is something to it, but ultimately the work truly is out there. I mean, you have not just literature reviews, right? You have meta-analyses on all these different topics. The question though, again, is like, okay, now that we know, what do we do? So it's the whole thing of like, the dog is caught up to the car. And now we're kind of at a loss for what to do next here. And yet in some ways we know what to do next, but we're, for whatever reason, right, and there are some complicated reasons for it, we have an inability to actually intervene with projects that are going to move the needle for people.
I want to hone in on some of the specific critiques you have, and you refer to this concept of health equity tourism. Can you tell us what you meant by that, and just explain what a health equity tourist is?
Yeah. So this is an idea that's been around for, Argo's been around, since forever. Just kind of implicitly, people think about this idea that there are people doing research who kind of fetishize the work. A lot of them are, just kind of your classic academics who have a very tangential interest in these populations. So I would look at it like this, right? Think about any given profession that you could have. There's this argument that you have your intrinsic motivations, right? I do this because I'm from this community. I care about these people. Then there's also the extrinsic, which is I can make a buck. I like the prestige, right? Which are totally separate things. And the reality is for most things in academia, you're going to have a little bit of both, right? You want to get a decent salary, which, sometimes you do get, sometimes you don't. And then also, usually you would hope that you actually care about these populations. So a health equity tourist is going to be somebody who is more on the end of like, this is just kind of cool stuff. I like science. I maybe like to crunch numbers, not to knock like biostatisticians because I don't want them coming after me, but that's kind of that type of person, right? Who's like just very good with numbers, who can run all these complex multivariate analyses, but like couldn't really care less about the research questions, let alone, the population itself. So that type of person, I would argue, dominates the field of public health. So if you think about, what do you need at the core to maintain a position in academia? You need projects, right? You need to publish papers. You need to get grants first and foremost. And provided you do that, you don't need to have any level of care or any kind of affinity for those populations. And the argument within that argument is that if you don't care about these populations, I wouldn't even go so far as to say you have to have lived experience, right? Like if you've never been unhoused, I don't think that means that you can't do research with that population. But if you have been, I would think that the level of nuance in which you apply to that project is going to be infinitely higher.
That's something you also get into, which is the idea of equity clout. And yes. And the idea that right now the game is sort of designed to really elevate like the high level researchers and the lower level kind of people who may have clout in the community are devalued in some way. And somehow that feels really not set up to drive outcomes. So can you tell us a little bit more about that, the idea of equity clout?
Yeah, so I think you really put it together well there. The idea behind that is saying we need something to make a connection with our research populations. And historically, which has been problematic, like we've done research, we go into communities, right? We do our surveys, we do our interviews, we take that data out, and then those populations get nothing. Maybe they get, $15, $20 Amazon gift card, and then that's kind of the end of it. And then we go back and we get, a salary, we get benefits, we get the opportunity to publish in journals, go to conferences, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm saying with this idea of equity cloud is if we were to do this work thoughtfully, and actually this ties into that whole idea about trust, right? The whole thing with the NIH and CDC right now, which is dubious, but, on a higher level, it's actually a good ambition to say we're going to restore trust. And by the way, like, are we actually doing that? Are we measuring that in any discernible way? I don't think so. But the thinking is that if you have equity cloud, you are seen as somebody who is trustworthy. You're seen as somebody who's authentic. and you're seen as somebody who is an authority. And you're an authority by virtue of those first two things there. So I think an open question for any researcher, for any leader at a CDC or health department is, do you have equity clout? And then the natural jump on off point from there is like, well, how do you actually know? Like, do people really trust you? Do you see you as authentic? I think one of the things that, kind of, again, falsely is implicated with the Trump administration is like, these are just down to earth people, right? They get your struggles. They're being genuine, right? They tell it how it is. And you kind of get that in those interviews that are being done by people from the administration. So there is something to that. Obviously, you'd like to see it done with a little bit more fidelity and earnestness, but that's the general idea behind Equity Cloud.
Yeah, and there's a lot of counter arguments, which I'm sure we're going to discuss and get your thinking on those. But I just want to go a little bit further in your piece. It almost seems like you're saying that this system is incentivized to actually not solve the problem. Because if you solve the problem, it takes sort of a piece away that you could then get future funding for to continue to document the problem. I mean, is that where you're going with this? Is the system sort of de-incentivizing finding solutions here in order to keep the money flowing?
So maybe not at that quite level, but I do think that there are very obvious advantages of this work continuing, right? There are advantages in saying, okay, maybe we've kind of solved this thing, but wouldn't it be cool if we ran this particular model? Or what if we do AI, right? What about the AI approach to all these things, right? Which is, I believe, going to be the new wave here. So there's no doubt about it, right? The whole conversation about indirects, right? All this extra money that institutions get, I think is a very valid one. And obviously I need, want to be a little careful and nuanced about how I talk about that because all of our institutions get it. And I do think there's something to be said about the rates, which I think, to be honest, I think have been way too high. I think that if you try to account for those dollars and say, does this really contribute to or support the research enterprise, the answer to that a lot of times is no. I think we could be a lot more thoughtful on how we use those dollars for the research there. But as far as like the larger, scheme and planning, yeah, I think there's absolutely something to that. Like, these large R1 institutions, they are looking at these grants, they're anticipating these grants, right? And the language there, the gravy train, I think is absolutely right. Like we've gone unimpeded for 20, 30 or so years with this money coming in from established senior researchers, and they anticipate that, right? It's like, I expect to collect, now I'm not collecting, which is why you get all these statements from top universities saying, this is a travesty, et cetera, but they're not really acknowledging like, have we actually done something impactful? And I want to just kind of make another point within that, which I touched on a bit in that piece, which is look at any given school of public health, maybe to a lesser extent, any school of medicine, or let's just say any health sciences program really, and go on their website and by and large, or what you'll typically find is that they're on there saying, we have a great, public health program, we have a good allied health program, et cetera, et cetera. And usually there's something in there saying that we are solving huge issues when it comes to public health, right? We're addressing health disparities, right? We're working in the global south, et cetera, et cetera. So there always is this messaging that like we are doing something that the world and these communities need, which is again the same thing that local law enforcement does, that the military does, right? We're doing these big ambitious things, but then you say, is this actually addressing these issues? So all of the language and messaging around impact is directly there right in front of your face. So they can't say, that they're not doing that, but they're not really being held to account in terms of whether or not we're accomplishing it, right? So if you go on John Hopkins' website, if you go on, any even large, entity that is the School of Public Health, you'll see bragging, right? Like we get billions of dollars of funding, right? We have all these grants, but there's never any real conversation like, are you saving lives? Are you reducing morbidities? Because the answer to that a lot of times is probably on the whole, in terms of the dollar spent, not really.
Well, I don't know. Hold on one second on that. I mean, This sure sounds like a lot of friendly fire here because, the public health community relies on this funding chain. I mean, if you talk about, outcomes, we have seen outcomes. I mean, look at cancer mortality in different populations. Look at like AIDS mortality, just things like end stage renal disease, which, definitely impacts African-American communities in a different way than whites. We have seen a lot of, improvements in those. I mean, sickle cell anemia, like all these things. I mean, that is all possible. And, they kind of do deserve some bragging rights at, these places that have spent all that money. But, do you want to like take a step back a little bit on the like the precision of your your claim that we were not really getting the outcomes, because we do hear that a lot. Jay Bhattacharya has said something similar. Look, like, we've spent all this money, but life expectancy hasn't changed, or we still have all these chronic diseases. But are you really saying that, like, the entire system as it is designed isn't working for those communities?
I'm not going that far. What I'm saying is it's not working as well as it could. I'm saying I think there's a lot of money that's misspent, that's directed for, really kind of fanciful projects that we don't need. I think a lot of times people who are being funded don't really have an earnest interest in solving these issues. Like, it's more of like, again, this fetishization, right? There's kind of like a certain kind of kink that goes along with it, right? Just these, ever more complex research models that, again, are just purely for the novelty factor there. So what I said, yeah, I would stand behind that and saying, on the whole, I think that we've done a tremendous disservice in saying we care about these communities, but haven't really improved and moved the needle in, I think, the ways that it should have been, right? If you think about
enough,
this, the
you mean
totality, enough, right? Given all the money that's been put out there over there, and keep in mind, like, there is a whole symbolic element of they use the health disparities language as a way to kind of like, prop themselves up. Right? When an organization, university says we do health disparities research, it's a bit of that soft power, right? Like, we care about these communities, and it's disingenuous is what I'm saying on the whole. So I don't at all think that we aren't addressing something. Sickle cell anemia is a great example. Even morbidities related to cigarette products or tobacco products. I think there's been big gains there. But what we deserve is this, right? Over time, things, and I'm just saying this again kind of broadly, things tend to get better for everybody. Let's say over the last 20 or so years, right? So everybody's rising, but it's the case that white and higher income people are always rising a little bit more, right? So everybody's going up, which is good. So when we talk about life expectancy, it is better, right? By and large for everybody. But in terms of the cleavages, they're there. So if you're telling me, right, your function is to eliminate disparities, you are not doing that. So that's the larger point there. But again, when it comes to most cancers, HIV, AIDS, et cetera, things we've dumped billions and billions of dollars into, why are we not moving the needle on those things? And also, I think another thing that needs to be taken into account here is think about these communities, right? So if you are talking to people in these communities and asking them, do you think this research is beneficial? So you had me in your clinical trial for asthma, right? Like, has this been actually beneficial? When you look at some of the data, when you look at some of the qualitative interviews, a lot of times people are completely unenthused by the end product. But the researcher is now fed, right? They've got a pipeline to be funded for 5 or so years. So there is a complete and utter mismatch between the benefits for the researchers and the institution and the people who are actually experiencing the disparities. And I firmly believe that is a systemic issue, and one that certainly the current administration is not equipped to address, but also prior administrations haven't tackled that either.
So let's get into what that a more successful vision would look like. That, what are metrics that you look for success? And I do appreciate the point you're making is that even the way studies are conducted and who's given funding and whether the principal investigator is white or black, like, those choices all determine, per your article, how a study is conducted and therefore. But talk to us about what health outcomes you think you're looking for to determine whether health disparity research is working or not.
Yeah. So I think part of it is a conversation to, I think there's like a very long lost kind of neglected stepchild metric, which is, I think, quality of life. So think about it like this, right? Now I think we can all kind of apply this to ourselves here. Like, when you think about your life, you think about, like, your level of happiness, you think about, your access to resources and minis. Can you do the things you want to do? Can you buy the things you want to do? Like, that's a rough kind of crude metric when we think about quality of life. The other conversation oftentimes is about longevity. Like, life expectancy has been a huge metric in public health for a really long time, and it makes sense. There's this kind of general, which is an intuitive thought that the longer I live, right, the better my life was, right? Just subjectively speaking, like, the longer I'm around, right, there's this presumption that, there are better things happening for me because I just get more time to experience the world. I think there needs to be more of an emphasis on quality of life. And part of the conversation about quality of life is very much centered around these social and economic conditions of a community, right? All the social science stuff is in that particular realm there. And I think when we are trying to construct these interventions, we need more attention to the community space, right? The neighborhoods that people are into, and not purely thinking in terms of like, are we addressing, A1C at this particular level? Are we bringing down blood pressure rates and things of that nature? So that's a metric that I really like there. But of course, you have to think about the conventional ones too. So a lot of work that I do is centered around opioid overdoses. And, we work with rural communities. So it's not always, particularly racially and ethnically diverse communities. We work in rural communities. And, what's the metric we need to look at? What's like the practical one? You don't want people to die from overdoses, or you don't want them to contract, a disease from sharing injection equipment. So those are kind of more tangible brick and mortar metrics that you want. But I think quality of life is a wonderful metric that we don't pay nearly much attention to, because that's like the more tangible, visceral, everyday of things, right? That people want to feel connected. They want to feel like they belong here. And so much of what's happening at the NIH right now is like truly foreclose the opportunity to look at things like that. I'm not saying that's the panacea, but just to kind of give you a general sense of a metric that makes sense that we don't really pay a lot of attention to.
I mean, when you talk about quality of life, obviously everybody I think has a general sense, like you described, of what that is.
Sure.
But I mean, that's also kind of a soft, you have all these like questionnaires that you might have like a 17, set questionnaire. Then, depending on how you answer that. I mean, some people look at that as what we call, soft science, and not
Sure.
something that's a great use of resources. Sort of like, it's almost like the opposite of like survival. Are you living longer? Do you have lower, objective measures of, cancer? Do you have, lower abnormalities in your cardiac labs? Like quality of life, it seems like a little bit of a tension area, because to think that we're going to invest, or as a solution be like, let's look at just quality of life, sort of goes against what we're hearing from the administration on some of these hard things. Like, for example, life expectancy. Is that a real good measure, or should we not listen to Jay Bhattacharya and turn towards like things like quality of life?
Just to answer that first, no, we should not listen to him on pretty much anything. But in particular on that conversation, that suggests to me like a real lack of social emotional intelligence, right? So when we think about something like quality of life theory, I agree, like it is one of those softer metrics. And also there's a lot of subjectivity that's built to it. But there's also a lot of correlation, right? Like we know when people are in better health and their quality of life is going to be higher. I'm just suggesting, like, as a proximate factor, there's a lot of value and insight that we can glean from the social emotional standpoint in terms of where people are at, what they're looking for, what they're expecting. And that's been really missing in terms of a larger conversation. So true, I think one of the best ways sometimes to ground these conversations is just to think about talking to Joe Schmo off the street and asking that person, like, what are the things that are important to you when it comes to health, right? What are the things that make you feel happy, grounded, supported, et cetera, et cetera? And to be sure, right, somebody who has type 2 diabetes, like having that A1C down matters a lot there. But if the social conditions, if the economic conditions are poor, then, it's kind of like there's a bit of negation going on here. So the larger point here, right, when you think about just to put it like in more vanilla terms, or you think about like, how do we eliminate health disparities? The conventional view, if you think about something, are you all familiar with the fundamental causes of that idea, Lincoln Phelan?
No.
Just to explain what that is. So
Tell us.
It's a great theory. Yes. Great theory that's been around for about, at this point, 30 or so years, that says in order to eliminate disparities, and I'm going to paraphrase here, you have to eliminate the things that are happening more at that macro level. And the thought is that, I can give you a regimen for managing your A1C. I could say, well, you're going to intake these particular fruits and vegetables. You're going to go for these walks. You're going to get these checkups, et cetera, et cetera. But if I don't change your environment, your food environment, right? If I don't change the things that kind of contribute to you not wanting to go out for a walk, right? Or if I don't put fresh groceries in your community for you to access those amenities, then those disparities are always going to return. So one argument that I'm making in that piece is if we're not tending to the social and economic environment, then you're never going to eliminate disparities. And what our interventions tend to do is they get to the intuitive point of saying, like, well, how do you reduce A1C? Of course, you give people better foods, you remove foods from the diet, you have them exercise there. But it's like, it truly is a stopgap because they're not addressing those surrounding factors.
Jerel, it seems like in these arguments, these discussions, life expectancy and that closing that gap or failing to close that gap is just treated as like, that's the referee. That's the score. Like nothing, there's no complexity to it. It's if these programs are working, if these investments are working, that gap would shrink. Because that gap is not really shrinking. I mean, it's kind of moving up and down, and pandemic changed things. But because we're really not making progress there, these things don't work. I mean, I just want to push back and really test whether you believe that really is the right way to measure this. I mean, I think somebody could make an argument here that, these sorts of issues that we're dealing with took decades, if not centuries, to manifest. We are talking everything from access to healthcare, to food, to housing, to jobs, to stress, and that it's going to take a minute. It's going to take a decade. It's going to take 15 years to first map the problem before we can even begin to get to what do we do about the problem? What are those specific causes? And how do we start to tackle them? So that when we just say, life expectancy hasn't improved, it's all a failure, we got to change course. Like, that's just not like a mature, scientific, even plotting kind of way to get to the actual results. What do you say to that?
Yeah. So I have a few thoughts. So one thought is that if you think about, just kind of think a little bit longitudinally here, like you think about in the 19th century, before that point, right, life expectancy was pretty low. I mean, and we also didn't have, rigorous studies to get at quality life and things of that nature. But there is a question within that, right? Like, obviously, we've dramatically improved. We're talking, 15, 20, 30 plus years compared to just 150, 200 years ago, which is pretty remarkable. Like, as a public health phenomenon, like, that is a huge development. The questions, though, I think really do remain in terms of, like, how do people feel, right? You can be a person who's living up until, a higher age, but also, be depressed, right? Be very socially isolated. So it starts to invite these questions of, like, which matters. And it doesn't have to be either or, but let's just say it is, right? Like, if you are, and I don't want to throw out precise numbers here to be ages, but if you are this particular age, right? So let's say let's just throw it out there, like you're 85, 90 years old, right? And you're alone, right? You are disconnected. You are not necessarily, feeling well per se, right? But you're living, right? For any number of reasons, largely probably attributable to the medical regimen that you're on. Versus being maybe in your 70s or your mid 70s, right? And then actually, being healthy, right? Being mobile, right? Being able to engage, having community, feeling connected there. Which of those, and again, this is, kind of just, bringing this down to a very baseline level, but like, which of those is a better life, right? Would you prefer to live longer and feel less good, to be less connected? Not saying it always has to be that way. Or would you prefer to, we'll say, check out earlier? I'm just, saying that to be a little bit glib here. With the opportunity potentially to live a fuller, more robust life here. So again, it doesn't have to be either or, but I do think that we don't spend a lot of time asking people about their experiences and what they want. We are a very kind of quantitatively driven society, so the logic is always longer and bigger. And I think when you apply that to public health, it's incredibly reductive. Not to mention, there's a lot of, and we haven't talked about this at this point, but there's a lot of cultural and racial aspects that go into that as well. So if you speak with somebody who is Latino or Black, they probably have a different impression on that because of lived experience, right? Because of how they think about their communities relative to a white person, which is all the more reason why we shouldn't be cutting DEI out of the conversations for our future research in these spaces here. So I don't think it's an either or proposition. It's probably a little bit of both.
Right. I mean, it's interesting, the idea of like hitting that number. We've always been raised to think that the greatest record smashed in the Guinness Book of World Records is the one for oldest human alive. But what I'm hearing you say is maybe that isn't the way that we should be viewing health. I want to move the conversation to, it was an interesting retweet you got, or repost, or whatever we say now.
Yeah.
Once you wrote that health disparities industrial complex research article from none other than Jay Bhattacharya, who said, Dr. Jerel Ezell with a spicy article, and I'm using his words. Tell us your reaction when you saw that, but also when he came on our show a month or so ago, he said, quote, "There is no good argument I've ever seen that suggests that DEI funding has led to any improvement, even in minority health." I mean, it sounds like you are pretty aligned with him on this. What was your reaction when he retweeted and to that quote on our show?
So apart from the fact that like it gets the idea out there, I'm totally okay with that. But I don't see it aligned with, MAHA or the broader agenda there. But if we do intersect, we intersect there for different reasons. Like my argument is more, we just need to do DEI, if you want to call it that, better. You don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? And there's just so little nuance in how we, like, I would love to ask him, what exactly is DEI to you? And when you were having a conversation about like, is it this metric and the whole like I'm not sure how well you remember your conversation here, but the whole thing about like, well, is this a bias? That's not a scientific question. Is this a metric? It's like, no, bias is a metric. You can measure it. There are questions about internal, external validity here. So there's just a lot of things there that just felt really off and like deliberately disingenuous from his part.
In our conversation with Jay Bhattacharya, he really made the case that you can't, as a scientific endeavor, go out and prove or disprove that structural racism is to blame for poor health outcomes, or bias is to blame for poor health outcomes, bias among medical staff. That these are too vague. That even if it were structural racism, how could you ever have a control group to test this against where there is no structural racism because it's structural? Or if you were able to prove it, what would you do about it because it's structural? Do you agree with that?
Well, I think there's some muddying of language here. So ultimately, you talk about structural racism. I mean, you are talking about something that's foundational, something that's historic, but you're also talking about the actions of everyday people. So if you're thinking about bias, there absolutely are ways to measure that, like the whole, the Harvard Implicit Association test, which is not perfect, but it is one instrument where you can see, like, do you have a preference for this over that, like this skin tone versus that tone, et cetera, et cetera. So I completely disagree that you can't operationalize this idea. And if that's the case, I mean, you could make that argument for pretty much any social science construct. So I completely disagree with that. And I think most social scientists would disagree with that notion. Now, to the point that as we're doing this research, we need to be a little bit more precise. I would agree with that. I think I've seen research that has been a little loosey-goosey about what these things mean. But can you describe and operationalize what racism means? I think absolutely. So I think that's ridiculous. And there's plenty of research, including validated research, that would point in that direction and say that's the case there.
Yeah, he really was, making a case also that it had to lead to some sort of intervention, and the intervention could be tested, whether an intervention in a medical setting, like a protocol or a checklist for doctors, could we then see a change in the outcomes of a particular race? But you don't tend to prescribe to that, right? You're saying bias is measurable, bias is important, bias is impacting people's health outcomes, and we need to study that.
Absolutely. And I think there reams and reams of peer-reviewed literature that would also point in that direction, saying you can measure it, you can intervene on it as well. And it doesn't always have to be restricted to, your trainings, but there are very tangible ways, not to mention, which I think is also important. And his lens is just, and I don't want to just restrict to him, but so much of his lens is very much individual level, right? Like all the ills in the public health system are attributable to people and individuals and not structures. And I think it can be a little bit of both. I mean, one kind of feeds into the other there. But this, again, I think it's very reductive to say, it can only be just one particular type of way. It's just we need more depth and thought in terms of how we're doing that type of work.
Jerel, as we wrap, do you think that some of these changes that you talked about in that in that article, the health disparities research industrial complex, do you think that can be done regardless of who's in the administration, that these are changes that, folks inside academic public health, the institutional public health can start making it today?
Sorry, you're talking about the changes? Do we think that the changes could be implemented?
Yeah, that
are recommended in there?
Yeah, exactly. Do you think that this is something that you need government allyship, and I take it that you don't think that this administration is the right partner for some of this stuff, but can places, those big institutions you were naming before, in terms of, eliminating that health equity tourism type mentality and changing the grant funding process and things like that, can that be operationalized, or does that require government support in some way?
I think it's probably not realistic for us to rely entirely on private industry and foundations to fund this work. I mean, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has been tremendous in this space, particularly in supporting health disparities related research. But it's hard to imagine a scenario where you would get large corporations and foundations to step in and fill that gap there. And also think that American taxpayers, they see value in this work, but when it's so poorly articulated in terms of what it does, including from researchers, right, who don't always explain what we're doing and why, there's a huge chasm between public health and communities. And I think that's another issue. Like when it comes to that trust piece that's been discussed, is we're really not in these spaces explaining what we're doing, which has allowed, your RFK juniors the space and opportunity to go in and say we're doing things that we're not actually doing.
Do you think that people sometimes end up defending the institutions when what they really mean to be doing is defending sort of the underlying values? In other words, that you value this kind of research, you value tackling this horrific problem, and somehow that ends up putting them on the side of, I'm against what Jerel's saying. He's attacking the institution, and the institution was doing the right thing, and I'm not going to take on board sort of this critique. Like when taking on board the critique might actually help deliver on the values, right? I mean, is that sort of your thinking, like stepping back from this whole conversation?
So I think the question about values is an important one, because again, that is what's implied. If you go on any of those websites, they're going to say, public health matters, right? This is critical for us to address X, Y, and Z issues. So all the messaging is already there. There's just a mismatch between what they're saying and I think what's being done in application there. And I think a lot of that comes down to, back to that earlier point here about the vested interest. There are a lot of very deep invested interests in this space. Like think about the publications, think about all the journals, think about all the fees that they charge universities and colleges to be able to offer their publications. Think about grad schools, right? MPH programs, like they're bringing in all these kids, right? And adults for these programs, charging all this money. So we're creating factories, we're creating cottage industries for this work. And a lot of times, in my experience, right, and also I'm implicated in it too, right? Like I'm a person who does research and sometimes federally funded research. So, but just a larger point of you have people in public health in this general space who have no real interest in the work. They're just doing it because, they're interested in methods. They want to crunch some numbers. Or again, it's just this, health equity tourism, fetishization of poverty and of non-white people. It's a combination of those things in my view.
Jerel, what I'm hearing you say, and where I think it has so much power, is this idea that, work by communities, for communities, with communities, really seems to be at the core of what you're saying, that we appear to be in this kind of a lopsided world here where the decision making is with folks who are least equipped to actually understand some of these communities. And the work that we do on the show, we frequently see that when we have direct conversations with communities or with community members who are very linked with communities. And I do think that deserves underscoring. People can have debates about the amount that they believe that they're kind of out of touch or whatever, and they may squabble with you about that. But I do think we're in an era now, and I see kind of a corollary with how people are talking about the Democratic Party, that where you have a consultant class that is kind of out of touch with the voters, and yet it's the consultant class that's advising candidates. And so to kind of move away from that, I see a similarity to what you're saying in public health, that it's almost like a consultant class in public health, like the McKinsey-fication of it. As opposed to in its roots, and what so many wonderful public health departments in this country and local health workers and yes, researchers as well are wanting to engage in. So I just want to thank you so much, Jerel, for joining us on the show today. Jerel Ezell. We're going to put his bio and links to his work in our show notes. Thank you for joining us. And Why Should I Trust You?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thanks, everybody.
And that was our show. I am Brenda Adhikari. He is Tom Johnson. She is Maggie Bartlett. He is Dr. Mark Abdul-Malik. Please send questions and comments to questions@whyshoulditrustyou.net. And we will see you right back here next time.